Hey everyone, welcome to this week's sermon scrap. On Tuesday, I realized I was supposed to do it yesterday, but it was a day off celebrating the 4th, so I'm coming to you today. So a few things from this week's message. We wrapped up our Why Do We Gather series, where it was based on Acts 2:42, so the four aspects that the early church devoted themselves to. So the first week we talked about we're commanded to. In Hebrews it says, do not neglect meeting together. And then we looked at the four characteristics, the apostles' teaching, the fellowship, the breaking of bread, and the prayers, but then half of a service every week is singing. And so we looked this past week at why do we sing. The two primary texts we took a look at were Ephesians 5 and Colossians 3. Not the whole chapters, but the whole chapters are worth reading to kind of get some comparing and contrasting going on. A couple things I wanted to point out or reiterate about the message yesterday. The first is I hope you sensed the idea that singing is soaked throughout all of Scripture. And so there's something unique about music that moves us differently than just reading something. That was the Jonathan Edwards quote I said, where he said, I can think of no reason why God would have us sing and use music instead of just prose, other than it stirs our affections. So music has a way of sticking with us. So a good example that I like to use about that is if you've ever watched a scary movie or an intense movie, if you pause the sound in the midst of that part, it suddenly gets less scary. So like the strings are building up in the background, it puts you on edge. And so if you pause the music from there, your emotions are not moved quite as much as they are as when there is music in the midst of that. Another piece I wanted to bring up, I talked through those three spheres. So everyone is worshiping all the time. So that's just general worship. A subset of that, when you become a believer, the Holy Spirit enables you to celebrate and participate in Christian worship. That is reframing and refocusing our worship from ourselves onto God. And then a subset of Christian worship is corporate worship. And I think where we often get misunderstood or misconstrued is conflating the Christian worship with corporate worship. So an example of this would be, there's a number of songs that I just love that I use personally as opportunities to worship and engage with God that would be terrible songs for us to sing on a Sunday morning. One example of that, I really like the artist Lecrae. Lecrae is a rapper, which means that he speaks a lot of words in a short amount of time. His songs would not be conducive to all of us corporately singing together. There's certain styles and genres of music that actually help us and better facilitate the ability for us to engage a little more readily than others. I'm a classically trained pianist. That was my background, my history. Classical music is not necessarily the same as what we regularly sing on a Sunday morning. And I think there has been an influx recently in musical illiteracy. Most people, if you give them a hymnal today, wouldn't know how to read it. Now, I actually have a collection of hymnals up on my bookshelf. I like looking back and seeing what we have sung throughout the ages. But not all hymns or songs that are in the hymnal are inherently good, and not all new songs are inherently bad. That is getting us into some things that I talked about a little bit yesterday. So what I did with my sermon yesterday is a bit of a talk I've given a few different places at a couple different churches and at a conference that the EFCA put together where I just talked through some of these theological and biblical ideas, and then how do we then live this out as a church? And so I talked yesterday, we need to center everything based on Colossians 3:16 around the Word of God, but then some application points of that is we should have a variety of songs with different styles, different ages of the songs. If you were here like a month ago, Tammy did a throwback Sunday where we did songs from like the 80s and 90s, and that was really fun. A lot of those songs were songs that I grew up singing, so it kind of brings me back to some of those earlier days in my youth. That also means that there needs to be a limit to how many songs we regularly sing. Now, depending on the individual church, it can be something anywhere from 50 is within your catalog up to 100 songs, because we only have a certain amount of brain space that we can fixate on. If you do more than a certain number of songs on your regular catalog, it becomes difficult trying to actually engage with the song and meditate on the words we're singing. So one of the practices I have encouraged Tammy and other churches to begin thinking is come up with a catalog of no more than 100 songs that we're going to sing in a calendar year. And then we can just repeat those songs regularly so that we can marinate in them, so that we can contemplate them, so that we can know them well enough to actually ingest the message of the songs. And then in addition to that is I would never do more than 8 to 12 new songs a year. So I would try to average like one new song a month, because in the Psalms we are actually commanded to sing new songs. And so there's ideas or issues or topics that we should be addressing through our songs on a regular basis that maybe we don't have a song that deals with this specific issue. And so we're going to tie it into that. The other piece that I have tried thinking through as well is what are some songs that would tie really well into a specific sermon series? And how can we then repeat those songs on a regular basis to help the message of the sermon and that sermon series really begin to soak and saturate into who we are? The other piece that I have done, I didn't talk about this yesterday, is one of the habits I have started doing is I won't do Bethel songs. So Bethel is a Pentecostal church out in California, and their primary pastor Brian Johnson has written and said some things that are heretical. He has said some things about Jesus that are just not true, that are not within the Orthodox faith. And so because of that, I don't feel comfortable supporting an organization, a church like that is trying to continue pushing some ideas that are contrary to the gospel that we believe in. So that's just a general blanket statement. If you want to talk further, like other churches have talked through or have tried to navigate this by saying we only do the good songs that they put out. And I agree. My preference though is we have 2,000 years of music that the church has put together for us to choose from. We don't have to try to keep up with the latest, greatest top 40 that's on the radio or the charts. Well, we should just sing the songs that we as a church need within the context or ideas that we are trying to communicate together. The other piece, I talked through a little bit about the book Christ-centered worship, where it's the gospel order of service, so adoration, confession, assurance, thanksgiving, etc. And so that some of what I was trying to communicate with that is I want the gospel both explicitly talked about and implicitly, even within the order of service. We can use our service order to communicate the gospel. And then I actually cut out a whole section in my sermon this week. I can talk about this for a long time, if you couldn't tell. And so the seesaw idea I got from a book called Worship Matters by Bob Coughlin. So this one is the one I've shared before that kind of solidified my call to ministry. And the last third of this book is called Healthy Tensions. And that I've seen that just as a really helpful way to try to talk through and navigate various theological issues. Another guy wrote a book, a guy named Zach Hicks wrote a book called The Worship Pastor, and he picked up on some similar ideas from those chapters on healthy tensions and did a whole page just outlining all these things to keep in mind. And he just called it a well-balanced diet, these things that need to be a part of our regular corporate worship. So I just wanted to share some of those things with you, some things to be thinking about as we gather together as God's people. Think of this idea of the transcendence and the immanence of God. So transcendence is God is separate, he is far from us, and immanence, he is close, he is here with us. So we have a passage like Isaiah 6:5, where Isaiah says, I said, woe is me, for I am lost, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips. For my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. So when he sees the transcendent God, he falls on his face and says, I'm not worthy. But then in Acts 17:28, Paul says, in him we live and move and have our being. That is, he's in us. He is here. And so how do we communicate these two tensions, these two ideas? Even our buildings facilitate certain aspects that can communicate either the transcendence or the immanent nature of God. For example, if you've ever walked into an old historic cathedral, what does everyone do the moment they walk in the door? They get quiet and their eyes are drawn upwards. If you are at a church meeting at a warehouse, no one does that. It feels very casual, very approachable. And so at a church like a high church, or even in our church building, what we need to do a very intentional job about communicating is the immanence of God. We have a huge sanctuary. It draws your eyes upwards the moment you walk in looking to our pulpit. At a previous church I was at, we were meeting in a converted office space. And so in that facility, we needed to work harder to communicate the transcendence of God. And so these are some of the things we need to keep in mind as we gather together. Another one, head and the heart. The way I often talk about this is doxology and theology. Our head is our theology. And I've even read before that many people miss heaven by 18 inches, the space from their head to their heart. And so yes, we need good theology, but we also need good emotions. Our emotions need to be corrected to become more like Christ. So Colossians 3:2, talking about your head, says, set your minds on things that are above, not on things that are on earth. Romans 12:1 and 2 says, be transformed by the renewing renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. So that's a head piece, but then the heart piece, a place like Psalm 32:11, be glad in the Lord and rejoice, O righteous, and shout for joy, all you upright in heart. Another tension, internal and external expressions. In Matthew 15, Jesus calls out the Pharisees and says, this people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men. But then external, Psalm 100 verse 2, serve the Lord with gladness, come into his presence with singing. Psalm 95:6, so come let us worship and bow down, let us kneel before the Lord our Maker. Psalm 134 verse 2, lift up your hands to the holy places and bless the Lord. Now, in the Worship Matters books, one of the things that he says is these descriptions, kneeling, standing in silence, giving a shout of praise, lifting up your hands, don't need to be markers of expression every week we gather together. But if you've never practiced any of them, are we being true to how the Bible talks about us as people? I've talked about this one before, the vertical and the horizontal dimensions that we need to be aware of. Psalm 96 verse 2 says, sing to the Lord, bless his name. So our primary audience is the Lord, but then Hebrews 10 says, let us consider how to stir up one another to love and good works. Or in Ephesians 5, it talks about addressing one another. So we are singing to God, we are also singing to address and remind each other. There's a tension of planned versus spontaneous. Now, some traditions, historical traditions, emphasize one or the other, and I think we need to be aware of both of them. What I would always tell people is we write everything we do in pencil, but we need to go back to the idea that God is the same yesterday, today, and forever. And so because God is the same yesterday, today, and forever, my planning and preparation and prayer that I do on Tuesday is just as led by the Spirit as my spontaneity would be on a Sunday morning. So a quick story of this, at the last church I served at, there was a team of other leaders that I was pouring into to train up to lead on a regular basis. And I encouraged them all to be planning regularly. There was one guy that grew up in the Caribbean that really enjoyed the spontaneous aspects of the corporate worship. And so he continued trying pushing this spontaneous part, that we don't have enough of that. And I said, yeah, we can do the spontaneous, but we have to plan for the spontaneous. And so it kind of came to a head one week where I'd encourage him, like every service, as you're thinking and planning and praying through it, have a call to worship ready, have a prayer ready, have a benediction ready, all these other pieces, because you don't know how the Spirit is going to move in the moment. And so he showed up to service that week, and there had been something that had happened, and the guy that was scheduled to preach wasn't able to, and so the pastor that normally did like the benediction and those kinds of things actually had to get up and preach. So he went and told this music leader, hey, you're up, I got to go preach. And he said, did Mike put you up to this? He said, no, why? He's like, because I actually took time last night to sit down and pray and plan this out, and now I'm ready to go. So we don't know how God's going to work in using these things. All we need to do is be faithful and then write everything out in pencil. Another one and I like the way he put this, is rooted and relevant. So we should sing old songs, but we should also sing new songs. Like old songs don't have the market on tools of expression towards God's, but neither do new songs. So we should try to do what we can to bring both those things that are historic and true and have been sung throughout the ages, and new songs, new ways of us expressing our devotion to God. Another one that's difficult is for the church and the unbeliever. So that there was a sign that I've seen people put in their homes that says, sit long, talk much, laugh often. And I think this is true. And so the aspect of for the church in Colossians 3:16, which is one of the ones that we studied together Sunday, it says, let the word of Christ dwell in you richly. That's not going to be as edifying or encouraging to an unbeliever. And so one of the things that we're doing when we gather together is equipping the saints, as Ephesians 4 says, for the work of ministry. But then we also have to always remember that there are going to be people that God is working in through his Spirit that are not going to be believers. So in 1 Corinthians 14, Paul is talking about these various spiritual gifts. He says, but if all prophesy and an unbeliever or outsider enters, he is convicted by all. He is called to account by all. The secrets of his heart are disclosed, and so falling on his face, he will worship God and declare that God is really among you. So every time what we're doing in our service, we need to be aware that there are probably going to be unbelievers in our midst. And so we need to trust that the Spirit is going to be working in the midst of us, and maybe even at times take time to explain what it is that we're doing, because it's going to look weird to someone whose heart has not been transformed by the gospel. The last tension that we need to be aware of is we worship as we're gathered and as we're scattered. So the gathered piece in 1 Corinthians 14:26, it says, when you come together, each one has a hymn, a lesson, a revelation, a tongue, or or an interpretation. Let all things be done for building up. So that is getting to the corporate aspect of our worship. But then we also worship as we're scattered. So gathering is what we do on Sunday morning. Scattering is what we do for the rest of our week. And this is 1 Corinthians 10:31. It says, so whatever you do, whether you eat or drink, do all to the glory of God. Give no offense to Jews or to Greeks or to the church of God, just as I try to please everyone in everything I do, not seeking my own advantage, but that of many, that they may be saved. So as we live lives of worship surrendered to God and surrendered to the gospel, we trust and pray that God is using us to bless others so that they can start to see the gospel made manifest in us and through us. That is living a life of full worship. So we have finished our series of Why Do We Gather, and this next Sunday we're going to pick up our Psalms, Summer in the Psalms series, and we'll be in Psalm chapter 3. So I'm looking forward to digging into that with you.